Most damage to your position doesn't begin with hostility or hidden agendas. It begins with comfort. With moments where you speak freely because the room feels safe. The people feel familiar, and the sentence feels too small to matter. Later, long after the conversation ends, a quiet regret settles in, not because someone attacked you, but because you realize your own words shifted something you can't take back. You didn't fail through action. You exposed yourself through language. The world is not interested in why you spoke. It only keeps what you said. Intentions vanish. Outcomes remain. That's the part no one teaches you. You think honesty builds trust, that explaining yourself creates understanding, that sharing pressure makes you human. In reality, each unguarded word leaves a residue. It forms a record, a version of you that exists independently of your effort, your skills, or your future performance. You don't need rivals working against you. You don't need betrayal or malice. Uncontrolled speech does the work quietly and efficiently. Venting becomes evidence. Openness becomes a data point. A single emotional moment can be replayed months later in a room you're not in, stripped of context and turned into a conclusion about who you are. This is how capable people get stuck without realizing why. Consider someone competent, steady, respected. One casual conversation releases a bit of frustration, nothing dramatic, just truth. Time passes. Then, during a decision that matters, that moment resurfaces as doubt. Pressure, tolerance, stability, reliability. The connection is never obvious, but the outcome was decided the instant the words left his mouth. People rarely lose because they lack strength or ability. They lose because they speak as if words disappear when spoken. They don't. They accumulate, they travel, and they return when you least expect them. Once you recognize how often your own words quietly turn into liabilities, a harder question surfaces. Who understood this first? Long before cameras, transcripts, or modern offices, someone was already watching people dismantle their own position the same way, by speaking when restraint would have served them better. Machiavelli wasn't obsessed with manipulation, despite how he's portrayed. His focus was survival in environments where power slipped away from people who should have kept it. He didn't ask how to overpower others. He asked why competent individuals kept surrendering ground without realizing it. And the answer was consistent. They reacted instead of deciding. They spoke to release pressure rather than to protect standing. He saw that power doesn't begin with charm, intellect, or dominance. It begins with control, with the ability to pause when instinct demands expression, with the discipline to keep your mouth closed when your ego wants relief. In his world, words were never neutral. They were signals, broadcasting impatience, fear, neediness, ambition, insecurity, the desire to be liked. The people who advanced weren't colder or more ruthless. They were more precise. They didn't confuse honesty with self-exposure or mistake openness for strength. This isn't an argument for becoming heartless. It's a warning against the habit of giving away leverage in moments that feel insignificant. Notice how often you explain yourself just to feel understood. How often you talk to smooth tension. How often you justify instead of letting outcomes speak. Each instance feels harmless, and each one subtly weakens your position. Machiavelli understood that authority erodes fastest when speech is driven by emotion instead of intention, and that silence, for him, wasn't virtue or morality. It was awareness. The awareness that not every truth needs to be voiced, and not every feeling deserves a platform, and that knowing when to withhold words is often what protects you most. What erodes your position isn't chance. It's a pattern that repeats in the same everyday situations where self-control quietly fades. These moments feel harmless while you're inside them, which is exactly why capable people lose ground when without ever noticing when it happens. The first and most common failure point never announces itself as danger. It arrives as justification. Anger doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like having the right to speak. Pressure builds and convinces you that silence is weakness, that restraint is dishonest, that now is the moment to release what you've been carrying. The instant you accept that logic, the filter doesn't break, it steps aside. What should stay internal suddenly feels urgent to expose, and no one has to push you. Emotion does the work for them. Your words start outlining where you feel cornered, ignored, undervalued, or threatened. In professional settings, this happens constantly. A decision is challenged, a comment lands wrong, your judgment is questioned, and you respond quickly and defensively. You reference long hours, past effort, unfair standards, ongoing pressure. It feels like self-defense, but it's really a detailed map of your stress points. Those words don't disappear when the meeting ends. They linger and resurface later as quiet doubts about temperament, emotional control, or reliability under pressure. The same pattern appears in personal life. A small disagreement escalates, and old frustrations surface with unplanned precision. You reveal what drains you, what hurts most, which memories still sting. The conflict ends. Apologies may follow. But the information remains, stored, remembered, reused. Anger doesn't erase information, it concentrates it. That's why it's valuable to anyone paying attention. Once someone knows what triggers you, they don't need authority or strength, only timing. Anger feels powerful because it's loud, but volume isn't power. Predictability is exposure, and anger makes you predictable. This isn't about denying emotion. Everyone feels anger. The difference is whether you let it speak for you, because anger doesn't reveal truth. It reveals leverage, and every sentence spoken in heat becomes a permanent record of who you are when pressure closes in. The second failure point doesn't announce itself through conflict or urgency. It slips in through comfort. There are no raised voices, no visible stakes, just ease settling into the room. Laughter lowers alertness, a drink loosens the body, and without realizing it, your guard never comes back up. This is where danger is most often misunderstood. Alcohol doesn't create new thoughts or turn you into someone else. It simply disables the internal gatekeeper that decides what stays contained and what gets released. As that gate weakens, the pause between impulse and speech disappears. Words don't come out because they're necessary. They come out because there's nothing stopping them. In social settings, this looks harmless. Stories expand. Details feel unimportant. You reference frustrations you'd normally keep private, joke about unresolved issues, casually mention ambitions, doubts, or plans as if they're insignificant background noise. It feels like connection. It feels like authenticity. In professional adjacent environments, team dinners, celebrations, informal gatherings, the effect is even more subtle. You want rapport, not distance. You talk about workplace pressure, leadership challenges, future possibilities, things you'd never commit to writing. Everyone appears relaxed. Everyone seems equal. But that equality is an illusion. Some people loosen their grip, others remain sharp. While one side speaks freely, the other side listens with precision. No one needs to probe or pressure. The information is offered willingly. What would normally take months to piece together through observation is handed over in a single evening. The imbalance doesn't register immediately. It becomes clear the next day. You remember fragments, a tone, a vague sense of having said more than intended. Others remember patterns, specifics, priorities. This is why the consequences of alcohol always arrive sober. What felt like bonding becomes context. What sounded like humor becomes interpretation. What you shared for relief becomes leverage. None of this feels threatening in the moment, and that's exactly why it works. Comfort dismantles defenses faster than conflict ever could. Hostile environments force caution. Friendly ones invite transparency. This isn't a call for isolation or emotional withdrawal. It's a reminder that even relaxed moments involve exchange. Clarity fades faster than memory, and people don't need you impaired to use what you gave them. They only need you to forget you ever said it. Some of the most expensive information you'll ever give away leaves your mouth easily, casually, once silence starts to feel unnecessary. The third breakdown doesn't come from emotion or ease, but from weight. The quiet kind that builds when time compresses and answers are expected before clarity arrives. Deadlines stack, expectations narrow, and suddenly silence feels risky, as if not speaking might be mistaken for failure. Stress doesn't tempt you to fabricate, it tempts you to unload. The mind looks for immediate relief, and the fastest relief is explanation. So you begin talking before you're asked, filling space to soften pressure, volunteering doubts to appear transparent, narrating difficulty to look responsible. But what slips through in those moments isn't professionalism or honesty. It's anxiety. It's hesitation. It's the unspoken belief that you might not be holding solid ground. Picture a task nearing its deadline, still unfinished, when an update is requested. You could pause, respond minimally, control the frame. Instead, you expand. You list obstacles, mention overload, hint at risk. It sounds reasonable, even diligent. Yet what you've done is surface uncertainty that didn't need a voice. Or consider a superior applying pressure, questions coming faster, expectations tightening. Rather than holding position, you defend, you explain, you disclose vulnerabilities that were invisible seconds earlier. Stress doesn't damage you in those moments, it unmasks you. People rarely remember how demanding the situation was. They remember the tone you carried inside it. Pressure reveals what you believe about yourself once comfort is stripped away. Whether you trust your footing or quietly doubt it. And once that doubt is spoken, it can't be pulled back. Others may offer understanding in the moment, but understanding isn't authority. Sympathy doesn't convert into influence. Respect erodes when pressure pushes you to narrate your own instability. This isn't about denying stress or pretending it doesn't exist. Everyone feels it. The distinction lies in how you respond when it arrives. Strong positioning absorbs pressure and tightens communication. Weak positioning absorbs pressure and leaks information. The real risk isn't failing while under strain. It's advertising fear while still standing. Pressure doesn't collapse you. It exposes you. And what you reveal under weight becomes the story others carry about your capability long after the urgency has passed. When you strip all three situations down to their core, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Anger isn't the threat. Comfort isn't the threat. Pressure isn't the threat. The real danger appears the instant you let emotions speak in your place. Each time you do, you make the same exchange without noticing it. Immediate relief for delayed consequences. You feel better for a moment, lighter, justified, heard, and then spend months paying for words you can't retrieve. Power rarely collapses in one dramatic event. It drains quietly through emotional sentences that linger long after the feeling has passed. That uneasy reaction you feel right now isn't resistance. It's awareness switching on. Hold on to it, because the pattern doesn't end here. What follows is more deceptive. The next set of situations exposes the same weakness, but without stress or vulnerability. This time, it's ego that steps forward, confident, articulate, convincing. nothing feels wrong. Nothing feels reckless. And that's exactly why people give themselves away even faster. Not through fear, but through confidence that feels earned. The fourth breakdown appears after things finally go right, not during struggle or loss, but in the quiet glow of success. Winning carries a risk that feels like reward, the urge to explain. You don't frame it as ego. You call it openness, generosity, sharing what you've learned. Yet the moment you begin walking others through how you achieve the result, something subtle changes. Every explanation becomes instruction. Every detail a usable pattern. Every clarification a blueprint that no longer belongs only to you. Think of what happens after a promotion or a major win. At first there's restraint, then questions surface, curiosity dressed as admiration. People want to know what worked, what you avoided, how you timed it. Slowly, confidence loosens your speech. You describe the sequence, the reasoning, the shortcuts, the judgment calls. It feels earned, even helpful. But the room shifts. Applause quietly turns into analysis. What was once impressive becomes understandable, and what becomes understandable becomes repeatable. Your edge stops being rare and starts being transferable. This is how power leaks after victory, not through collapse, but through celebration. Success convinces you that defenses are no longer necessary, that the danger has passed. You relax, you feel secure, you speak freely, and pride does what fear never could. It opens your mouth. The people who hold power over time recognize this impulse and resist it. They allow outcomes to speak loudly while keeping the process indistinct. They don't rush to be fully understood. They remain difficult to duplicate. This isn't about hoarding knowledge or cultivating secrecy for its own sake. It's about recognizing that not every question is admiration, and not every listener is an ally. Some are charting patterns. Some are preparing to copy. Some are waiting until what made you valuable becomes common enough to replace you. Power doesn't endure by being fully explained. It endures by staying just beyond reach. Clarity may feel generous, but mystery preserves advantage. Pinna? The fifth failure point doesn't rise from anger or success, but from something quieter and far more corrosive. The hunger to be seen, to be noticed, acknowledged, confirmed as capable, relevant, connected. This is where speech stops serving purpose and starts serving insecurity. You no longer respond. You narrate. You add explanations no one requested, defend choices no one questioned, extend sentences not for clarity, but for validation. The words keep coming because recognition hasn't. From there, it slides easily into name-dropping. Rarely obvious, always casual. References to people you know, rooms you've entered, conversations you were close to, framed as context, but driven by need. It feels like positioning, like smart signaling. Yet what it signals most clearly is uncertainty trying to pass as confidence. In professional environments, this pattern is constant. A discussion becomes a stage. An idea surfaces, and you feel compelled to show you already understood it, to layer on details, link it to past successes, highlight your involvement. You want the room to register your value, and it does, just not in the way you intend. Over-explaining doesn't read as competence, it reads as defense. Name-dropping doesn't suggest power, it suggests dependence. The harder you work to establish worth through language, the more you imply that it isn't obvious on its own. This is the quiet trap of ego-driven speech. It convinces you that more words will secure your position, while they steadily undermine it. The strongest presence rarely feels the need to announce itself. Stable people don't rush to clarify who they are or what they deserve. They allow behavior to shape perception and outcomes to form reputation. When value is real, it doesn't require commentary. The uncomfortable reality is that the urge to be seen usually appears just before too much is given away, because every unnecessary sentence exposes how much approval is being sought. And approval is a fragile base for power. The need to be noticed often isn't a sign of strength, but a signal that solidity is missing. The sixth failure point hides behind a word people trust far too easily: promises. Not the kind made from certainty or strength, but the kind offered to relieve pressure in the moment. When expectations tighten and answers are demanded before clarity exists, silence feels dangerous and honesty feels inconvenient. So the mouth looks for an exit and finds it in commitment. You promise not because the outcome is secured, but because committing feels safer than hesitating. In professional settings, this happens constantly. A deadline approaches, confidence is expected, and instead of slowing the frame, you lock yourself into timelines you haven't stabilized and outcomes that still depend on factors outside your control. It sounds decisive. It sounds responsible. Yet all you've done is turn pressure into obligation, and obligation into debt. And debt never stays quiet. The same mechanism shows up in personal life. Someone asks for reassurance, stability, and clarity about the future. Rather than creating space, you promise effort, change, consistency, a version of yourself that hasn't been built yet. At the moment, it feels supportive, even noble. It buys relief. But relief is temporary, and debt is not. Promises that can't be fulfilled don't cause immediate explosions. They cause erosion. People rarely confront you outright. Instead, they recalibrate. They stop leaning on your word. They listen differently. Over time, even your honest statements carry less weight, because credibility has been diluted. This is why people who understand power speak carefully about the future. Not because they lack ambition, but because they recognize their reputation as fragile capital. They don't spend it to purchase comfort during tense moments. They allow action to arrive before commitment, results before guarantees. They understand that restraint is not weakness, it's accuracy. This isn't pessimism or avoidance, it's precision. The lesson here is brutal, but clean. Every premature yes quietly mortgages your credibility. Ego loves promises because they sound confident and commanding. Power avoids them unless they can be honored. Because reputations don't collapse dramatically. They fade slowly, one promise at a time, until people stop expecting much from you at all. These three situations don't weaken you through panic or insecurity. They do it through confidence that feels earned and harmless. Each explanation, each performance, each premature promise slowly trades authority for comfort without setting off alarms. If any of this feels familiar, don't step away yet, because the next set of situations reveals something more deceptive: how trust itself becomes the mechanism that takes power from you. The seventh breakdown doesn't come from pressure, performance, or confidence. It slips in through something people instinctively trust: empathy. It begins when someone presents themselves as wounded in a way that pulls you closer instead of triggering alarm. Nothing dramatic, nothing unstable, just a clean narrative of being misunderstood, overlooked, or treated unfairly, delivered with enough restraint to sound credible. This is where defenses lower without conscious choice. Manufactured weakness rarely looks clumsy. It's controlled, coherent, emotionally intelligent. There's always a clear injustice, a reasonable explanation, and a tone that invites understanding rather than scrutiny. You see it at work when someone consistently frames themselves as the quiet victim of unfair systems, careful to appear sincere without sounding bitter. You see it in fast-moving relationships where personal pain is revealed early, not chaotically, but elegantly, creating accelerated closeness. You listen. You empathize. You feel trusted, chosen, morally engaged. And that feeling becomes the opening. Real vulnerability is messy. It leaks at the wrong times, contradicts itself, and doesn't know how to present its own pain cleanly. Strategic vulnerability is curated. It knows exactly what to reveal, how much sympathy it will generate, and when to stop before suspicion forms. While you're focused on being compassionate, the other side is observing. They track your responses, notice where your boundaries soften, measure how much imbalance you tolerate, and see how quickly guilt shapes your behavior. Each comforting reaction gives them information. Slowly, exceptions appear. Standards bend. Behaviors get justified. What you'd never accept from others becomes understandable here. The dynamic shifts quietly. Empathy turns into obligation. Care becomes leverage. This isn't about becoming cold, paranoid, or incapable of connection. It's about recognizing that not all shared pain is meant to heal. Some people disclose vulnerability to manage perception, not to resolve anything. And once guilt enters the picture, pulling back starts to feel cruel. You hesitate. You stay silent. You comply longer than you should. That hesitation is the mechanism. Guilt keeps you present, restrained, exposed. The lesson is sharp but necessary. Real vulnerability is unstable and asks for nothing, while strategic vulnerability is polished and always expects something in return. The eighth exposure point doesn't feel dangerous at all. It feels engaging. A conversation sharpens, voices drop, a name is mentioned, and a detail surfaces that clearly wasn't meant to travel far. Nothing about the moment feels hostile or reckless. It feels social, even connective, and that's precisely why it works. The instant you repeat information that was never yours to carry, your role quietly changes. You stop being a participant and become a conduit. Gossip isn't driven by curiosity, it's driven by transfer, because every piece of information moves power from one person to another. In professional environments, this exchange happens constantly and subtly. Someone references a manager's blind spot. Someone hints at a colleague's mistake. Someone adds context to sound plugged in. It feels reciprocal, but it isn't balanced. The person speaking is spending leverage. The person listening is accumulating it. Over time, these exchanges create a map. Those who talk freely become predictable. Those who listen without adding become opaque. Gossip doesn't just expose secrets, it exposes discipline. Each time you pass along sensitive information, you demonstrate how you handle access. You show whether closeness makes you leak or tighten. And that signal is remembered, not emotionally, but strategically. This is why people with real power rarely gossip themselves. They let others do it. They listen carefully, collect quietly, and observe who betrays confidence easily and who can hold it without needing release. Betrayal tends to move downward because it attaches itself to those who can't resist speaking. Information moves upward because it's drawn toward those who can contain it. The cost of gossip never arrives in the moment. It shows up later, when fewer meaningful details reach you, when strategic conversations happen around you instead of with you, when inclusion remains but substance disappears. You're present, but never informed. This isn't about ethics or being virtuous. It's about position. Silence doesn't erase you. It makes you unreadable. And unreadable people carry leverage. The exchange rate here is cold and consistent. Speak to feel included and you give power away. Listen to understand and power quietly moves in your direction. Information rises. Betrayal sinks. The ninth and final exposure point appears at the most tempting moment of all. When you feel justified, certain, and morally clean, betrayal is no longer a suspicion, it's confirmed. Promises were broken, boundaries crossed, trust mishandled, and certainty convinces you that silence is weakness while speaking feels like strength. Your mind replays the evidence with precision. What they said, what they hid, the private information they once asked you to protect. In that state, speech feels earned. Your mouth becomes a courtroom and you step into the role of prosecutor, convinced that telling the truth will restore balance. But the instant you begin talking, the damage changes direction. You don't just expose their actions, you expose yourself. You reveal how you respond when hurt, how you handle power when emotions are high, how you manage private knowledge under pressure. In professional environments, this often hides behind the language of transparency or clearing the air. Someone lays out what really happened, framing it as honesty or closure. Yet observers aren't judging fairness, they're assessing risk. They don't hear integrity, they hear volatility. They see someone who speaks when wounded, someone who might one day turn private context into public narrative again. In personal relationships, the cost is even higher. When betrayal is followed by full exposure, you don't look principled or strong. You look unsafe. Others quietly learn that closeness with you carries conditions, that intimacy might later be repaid with disclosure if things go wrong. This is why this moment is so difficult. Silence feels unbearable because it feels like surrender, like letting harm go unanswered. But silence isn't surrender. It's containment. It's delay. It keeps leverage intact and options open. Words feel powerful because they create immediate reaction, validation, and applause. Silence feels empty because it offers none of that. But power is never measured by reaction. It's measured by position over time. Speaking spends leverage. Silence preserves it. And preserved leverage always outlives emotional release. This doesn't mean denying pain or pretending betrayal didn't matter. It means choosing where truth belongs and when it serves you. Not every truth needs a stage. Some truths are tools, some are weapons, and some are best kept sheathed. The final rule is simple and unforgiving. You don't secure your future by burning someone else's past. You secure it by remaining unreadable when emotion demands explanation, because silence keeps future leverage alive. What links these three moments isn't the words themselves, but the access behind them. Power wasn't taken by force or lost by chance. It leaked the instant the wrong people were allowed close enough to hear what should have stayed contained. If this recognition feels uncomfortable, don't dismiss it. That discomfort is the signal, because what comes next is about learning how to decide who earns access to you before that cost hardens into something permanent. This was never about reducing your voice. It was always about timing it correctly. People don't lose control of their lives because they speak too much by accident. They lose it because they speak when emotion, ego, or pressure is deciding for them. In those moments, expression feels powerful and relief feels like strength. But in a world that remembers everything, that confusion becomes costly very fast. Words no longer disappear. They linger, get stored, replayed, stripped of context, and judged without mercy. A single sentence spoken at the wrong moment can quietly undo years of careful positioning, because every interaction becomes evidence of who you are when tension is present. Power doesn't operate on urgency. It doesn't rush to justify itself or explain its intentions to feel legitimate. It understands that silence isn't absence, it's control. When you don't react immediately, you preserve options. When you don't over-explain, you remain difficult to replace. When you don't promise before certainty exists, you protect the one thing that compounds over time: credibility. This isn't manipulation or performance. It's discipline. The discipline to decide which moments deserve your voice and which ones don't. Most people give themselves away trying to be understood. They talk to be liked. They confess to feel lighter. They explain to appear fair or reasonable. And with each attempt, they spend leverage they didn't even know they possessed. The world consistently rewards those who can hold tension without leaking information, who don't rush to fill silence, who let their words arrive slowly and land with weight. Controlling your mouth doesn't mean becoming distant or emotionally dead. It means refusing to hand the world tools it can later use against you. Once words leave you, you no longer control where they travel or how they're interpreted. You don't get to revise the memory they create. People who understand power early learn that restraint isn't weakness, it's protection. This perspective isn't about winning arguments or dominating conversations. It's about building a life where fewer things can be turned against you, where reactions don't expose you, and where silence becomes a strategic asset instead of an uncomfortable pause. Weakness is loud because it seeks validation. Power is quiet because it doesn't need it. If this shifts how you hear your own words, don't ignore that awareness. Leave a few words in the comments describing what stood out to you. One sentence is enough. Subscribe if you want more of this perspective, because learning this early isn't motivation, it's leverage. And leverage, once gained, stays with you for life.